Park Farm, and so it continues. Hello, my name is Steve G and this is Bourne History Group. Now, it would be true to say that this is becoming a typical episode of Time Team, where in the first 10 minutes of the show, we are told one story, and then halfway through, Phil Harding or Mike Aston have changed their minds because some new evidence has come to light, and it has changed everything. And such is history. So, welcome to the non-time team. Now, I don't know who I would be, and I would like to think myself as Francis Pryor, Peter Sharp is Phil Harding, and Jamie Lawrence is Mike Aston. But in truth, I'm probably more Tony Robinson. And when I say Tony Robinson, I probably mean Baldric from Blackadder. So we are back discussing the words Park Farm, which is associated with Roman discoveries. Now the question is, why the obsession? What does it matter where Park Farm was located, or if it even ever existed? And to answer the importance of not so much the farm part, but the park, we need to read an excerpt of Peake's manuscript, an antiquarian who had written a 1380 description of the castle in Bourne. And Peake states, "Over ye moat it surrounds ye castle is a fair drawbridge. Ye moat is very deep. There is also a fair park belonging ye castle." Now we can see from the words of Peake that Bourne Castle had a park. In fact, it would seem quite a big park as he uses the word fair. What we don't know is where the park was situated. So when we have names that refer to the park, we tend to get very excited. And the names we currently have is Westbourne Park and Park Farm to the west. These names in the west could suggest that there was a park to the west of Bourne, which would make sense as there are the woods to the west which are normally associated with parks. We also know that in 1816, William Marriott describes the Roman finds which were found in the park grounds, and this area was determined to be in the south within the grounds of the Red Hall. So here we have two areas which are linked to the park. One theory, which had been suggested from a Bourne History Group member, was that the West Park and the South Park may have been one large park. A pretty good theory, and one we may go back to, thank you Andy Platt. During the last discussion, the age of Park Farm to the west was brought into question. It was believed that maybe the farm isn't really that old, and bearing that in mind, I decided to investigate. On an 1815 map, it appeared that the farm was in existence. However, I decided to cross-reference it with maps from the early 20th century and late 19th century. The farm had been on the early 20th century, but when I studied the late 19th century map, there was no farm, which means we have a Time Team moment where Phil Harding says what we thought was, but what we think now is. So the question is, how does the farm appear on the 1815 map but not on the late 19th century map? Now, Jamie Lawrence and myself have seen this before whilst covering buildings in the census, and buildings have been in one census but then disappear and then return in a later census. Quite simply, what is happening is that a building has been knocked down and then rebuilt at a much later date, thus creating a gap between records. However, and there's always a however, there was something not quite right with the 1815 map. So I did an overlay, which isn't perfect because of the scale of the buildings on the map. And what I found was that the farm did not line up with the current Park Farm. And this would mean that the farm was not in existence in 1815, making the current Park Farm about 120 years old. Now, park is also noted in the street name Westbourne Park, but that name is even younger than the current Park Farm. Without evidence, it would be speculative to suggest that the park was in the west. So, it should be quite straightforward that the park of the castle must have been to the south. But if only it were that simple, because if the park was associated with Bourne Castle as stated by Peake, then it would have belonged to the Manor of Bourne. So we would need to establish who owned the land south of Bourne. And before we do that, I would like to investigate further the possibility of there being a park farm in the south. And the good news is that the farm in the west would not have existed in the 18th century. This in itself will eliminate the confusion two farms of the same name in the same era would have caused. The absence of a park farm to the west increases the likelihood of a park farm to the south. Now, just a reminder that the park grounds to the south is not in dispute, as it is quite clear that park grounds is written in Marrett's publication of 1815-16 original source. Now, I called upon the expertise of Jamie Lawrence to search through the census. Again, this process is not straightforward as there are many variables which need to be worked out. For instance, like we have mentioned earlier, some buildings which were present in the 1800s may no longer be around. And there is also the matter of the route the official would have taken, which can change in every visit and quite often does. There are always clues, and thankfully Jamie has a keen eye and was able to spot things as mere mortals would have absolutely missed. Our goal was to find the name of the farm in the south. My other aim was to find the first mention of Park Farm associated in the south from source material. We began our research of the census with what we already know. We know the farm was called Gray's Farm in the 20th century. Now what this tells us is that if we find the Gray family, then there is the good chance we have found the farm. The other thing we need to bear in mind is that the railway wasn't in existence in the first census of 1841. Now amazingly, the first entry we discover is a word, park or back, which is crossed out, and gardeners' houses is entered instead. And even though it reads houses, there is only one building. This home belongs to the Selbys, and it's probably worth mentioning that his occupation was gardener. Now we since learned that the written word was park because of what we discovered in the following census. Now we were unable to locate the name of the farm or the occupants in 1841, so we moved to 1851 where we discovered entry 145 as being Red Hall Park. The occupation for the current owner is no longer gardener, instead they are carpenters. In 1861 there is a Park Fields, and in 1881 there is another entry of Park Fields. Also in 1881 there are two farmers, one of them is called Brinkley. The name of the farm is not mentioned and does not get mentioned even when the farm is taken over by the Greys. So what have we learnt from this investigation thus far? Park Farm to the west is relatively new, about 120 years old. We can also confirm that the area to the south was called Red Hall Park, Park Fields, the Park, according to the census of each associated year. We have been unable to find any mention of Park Farm in relation to the south. We could speculate at this stage the farm may have been colloquially known as Park Farm, but no evidence has been revealed during this investigation. We do, however, have a reference from C.W. Phillips in 1934 in his journal Present State of Archaeology in Lincolnshire, where he writes at the very end of his journal, amongst other finds in Bourne, Roman tessellated pavement found in 1776 at Park Farm, referenced as taken from Trollope with the number 37 after his name. And this is most likely Edward Trollope, Bishop of Nottingham and archaeologist, who lived between the years 1817 and 1893, therefore post-Marrett. Now my conclusion at present is that with the compounding evidence revealed through the means of the census, the area within proximity of the Red Hall was called the Red Hall Park. It would stand to reason that the farm associated with the park may have been colloquially called Park Farm, although in the middle of the 20th century it was colloquially called as Gray's Farm, named after the last occupants, where it was demolished in 1977. Now, whether it was ever officially called Park Farm is in doubt, as there has been no evidence to support that claim. At present, we have no real association of a park in the west. Instead, the location of a park seems to point to the south. But was it the castle's park? Like I said earlier, it is never that straightforward. There is nothing more at this point than I would like to conclude that the Red Hall Park belonged to the castle, and at one point in its life, this area was indeed under the ownership of the Lord of the Manor. In fact, there was a time when the whole of Bourne was under the ownership of the Lord of the Manor. But all that changed when the Manor of Bourne was split into two separate manors, Bourne Manor and the Manor of Bourne Abbots. Who did the Red Hall grounds belong to? And is there a way of finding out? And this is the part where Tony Robinson goes over to Francis Pryor or another member of the team to find out how. Between the years of 1860 and 1960, parts of the grounds had been owned by the railway. Prior to that, it had been owned by Catherine Digby, wife of James Digby, who had bought it of Richard Warwick, who had bought it from Richard Dixon in 1698. And prior to 1698, the house and grounds belonged to the Fisher family, who had built the Red Hall in 1605. We do not know how Gilbert Fisher acquired the land to build the Red Hall, but it would seem that upon his death he was in debt, and one of his debtors was the Marquis of Exeter, aka also known as Lord of Bourne Manor. It would stand to reason, although I'm being speculative, that Gilbert Fisher had bought the land from the Marquis of Exeter. Well, that seemed rather simple. However, if one was to search through the records, one would soon find the Abbott's map of 1825. What one would notice is that the Red Hall and its immediate surrounding land is owned by Catherine Digby, yet the land around the Red Hall, which would also be classed as the Red Hall Park, is owned by Philip Duncan Pontiford Digby. That's a pretty long name. This is particularly interesting because PDPD, for short, is connected with the Manor of Bourne Abbots. Now, we could have concluded that the Red Hall grounds may have belonged to the Lord of the Manor and left it at that. But if we don't deal with this potential confusion, then future generations may not fully understand what is going on and may be led to the conclusion that the land had belonged to the Manor of Bourne Abbots, which is kind of true, but not entirely. So, who is PDPD for short? He is the nephew to James Digby, and James Digby is the husband to Catherine Digby. What we soon realise is that the Digbys have been, throughout their ownership of the Red Hall, buying the lordship and lands of the Manor of Bourne Abbots. The Manor of Bourne Abbots had been privatised since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1500s. And this purchase of the Bourne Abbots land here in Bourne is post-Red Hall. Had the Fishers been lords of the Manor of Bourne Abbots, then the title and lands would have passed down through their line. As it stands, the lands and lordship of the Manor of Bourne Abbots had been purchased by the Digbys. Therefore, we can conclude with almost certainty that the Red Hall and its park had once belonged to the Lord of Bourne Manor. Now, at the beginning, we had looked at the words of an antiquarian by the names of Pekes, who had stated Bourne Castle had a fair park. I believe with all the available evidence that the Red Hall Park and the Fair Park, as mentioned by Pekes, are one and the same. And I would speculate that the park area did stretch, as suggested by the BHG member Andy Platt, all the way from the south and over to the woodlands to the west. Now, what has suddenly occurred to me during this wonderful piece of investigation is actually how special the Red Hall really is. It would appear that we never really lost our castle. It simply moved further south and over the water. As an added piece of information, when Catherine Digby had graced the buildings with her ownership, she was referred to as Lady Catherine. Now, how appropriate that now seems. The Red Hall is a continuation of the Bourne's castle story, a link to the castle, a reminder of Bourne's splendour, and long may it stand.